It's great to be back. Thank you, Mami, for this summary of a life. And thank you, Joanne, and all of the Biennale of Sydney for hosting this series of talks, which gave me the privilege of being able to come and see this exhibition. Which I haven't seen yet in its fullness, but I've seen Cockatoo Island and found it wonderful. So there has been a problem. The problem is that on the way here from London, I lost my laptop in Singapore, and it was not found. And therefore, the 12 hours prepared lecture on the flight and what I had intended to show you as a PowerPoint, I don't have. However, a nice thing happened, which is that the museum, the Castello di Rivoli, sent me a ton of PowerPoints of previous lectures via WeTransfer last night or yesterday, and that was good news. And the second thing is I ran into a young lady who in 2015 published a book that was inspired partly by a conversation in Sydney at a Chinese restaurant over dumplings about what could love be in the digital age. And so I remembered in the pile of PowerPoints that were sent, one of them was my lecture on love of 2015. The same year that her book came out, which was after many, many years from that dumpling, which was eaten maybe in 2007 or so. And that reminded me of mathematical objects, such as the Klein bottle, which is a non-orientable surface and a manifold against which a system for determining a normal vector cannot be consistently defined. Basically, it's non-orientable, and it's like a 3D Möbius strip, where you cannot really tell what is the inside and what is the outside, what is the core and what is the non-core. So I'm going to do this talk in two parts. One will be trying to use the slides and see what's going on. And the second part will be having the slides roll on their own. And I'll read you, hopefully, the lecture on love, or at least part of it. So what I never do is this. This is not my way of dealing with archives and filing. I've never been good at it. More interested in this, which is composting. To compost is a very complex art and science. If you get the balance wrong, too much nitrogen, too much this, too much that, too little oxygen, it does not become this, which is a lovely, luscious earth. So in composting, I do sometimes look at places where people live. This is Anna Bogigian's studio in Cairo, where plants thrive with discs to listen and to capture waves of communication. This is about a year ago. Torino, as you were told by Mami, I'm now back home. My mother is from Piemonte, so I'm the director of the museums in Torino, particularly not this one, but the Castello di Rivoli. But I wanted in a quick synopsis tell you what my context is. And so we are known, the city of Torino, for having the second most important, according to Egyptologists, collection of Egyptian antiquities after Cairo. And it tells the tale of the relations with esoterics in Piemonte for centuries and centuries. In fact, Champollion said the road to Thebes passes through Turin. And because these collections were excavated by archaeologists in accordance with agreements with the rulers of Egypt at the time, more than a century prior to the age of colonialism and stealing of things, the museum is the only Egyptian collection in the world that's not with restitution cases right now, because a large part of the collections of the Cairo Museum itself were part of these excavations of the Torino teams. The second thing we're famous for is, of course, Fiat. Changes their logo all the time. And this is where they tested the cars in the 50s and 60s. I think it's totally reckless, but nobody fell off the top of the building. Currently, what we're known for is technology research. For example, Alenia has done the famous Mars rover. The first one, I think, crashed or something. But that's what we're about. And the second is, the third or the fourth is we founded Slow Food with Carlo Petrini, and we have the University of Slow Food, which then expanded to California and to the whole world, and we razed to the ground GMO fields of corn when, farmers attempted 20 years ago to plant them, and never since then has a GMO seed been planted in our territory. We're also famous for Arte Povera. So Arte Povera is one of the first movements in parallel to others, of course, but certainly one of the first that I know of, that in the mid-60s, inspired as well by other things such as Gutai that had been exhibited in Torino in 1955 as a first moment of seeing this outside of Japan, developed in the mid-60s what we today call installation art, and which then, of course, returned to all other places. For example, the travels of the Italian Arte Poveristi to Japan in the late 60s did influence the emergence of monoha. So it's a case of back and forth and cultural exchanges at that time. And as you can see, Alighiero Boetti with his different colored earths and so on remind me of Compost. And that was a group show of theirs. That's the Arte Poveristi with Robert Smithson and other people. The Italian Cunellis is sitting on a chair, installing a work by Zorio on the wall. And Pennone's work to reverse one's eyes is also one of my inspirations, along with Arte Povera. I showed this piece in the Sydney Biennial in 2008, and by putting on the mirrored contact lenses, Pennone blinded himself as he walked in the performance, but of course restituted in that reversal of the gaze the visual field that he would have seen had he not been blinded by the mirrors. So we see in his eyes what he would have seen in a kind of deliberate reversal and exchange of the authority over vision. The other figure that has widely and deeply influenced me has been Annie Besant, very close to Madame Blavatsky and one of the leaders of the Theosophical movement, who brought Theosophy also to Adyar, where many of the publications were then made, but also a radical. She developed as a Fabian socialist and then went on to jail for being in favor of birth control, because she thought that the working class could never be free unless the first step was to be able to choose parenthood. And so many of the things we know of the earliest successes in labor movement reforms, including many things that happened in Australia, lead back to Annie Besant's theosophical vision, which anticipated also many of the thinkings of today in quantum, actually, such as the concept of entanglement and other concepts whereby time and space are folded and very distant points in the universe connect. So Castello di Rivoli is this Baroque castle made of these two buildings so far. the Manica Lunga, the long sleeve on the left, and the Juvarra building on the right, built in the early 18th century. Armando Testa made the logo many, many years ago, and Left Loft modified it, but it's substantially the Armando Testa logo. And it's where I was prior to coming here. I don't know how it happened that I was asked to participate in the competition to do this, or called, I really don't remember, but maybe someone will. This is our museum, which is like a process architecture, because the architect who was building Juvarra on the left, the castle, was tearing down the Castellamonte and reusing the bricks. And then they ran out of money, the Savoia family, and there were wars and things. So it was suspended in time in this half-built and half-unbuilt building. That's what it should have been. And this is the inside. It's the home of Arte Povera. We have the largest holdings of Arte Povera in the world. And I was happy to see here the wonderful piece of Luciano Fabbro on the Church of Venice, drawn piece outside. So this is Boetti inside, Mario Merz. So we combine contemporary art of Luciano Fabbro in a historical setting. Marisa Merz. Most of our Arte Povera works, Pennoni again, are going to a large Arte Povera exhibition that will open in May at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. But parts of it have come to Sydney in an exhibition in the 2000s prior to doing the, it was at MCA, prior to doing the Biennale. This is the half-demolished building, of course, restored beautifully by Andrea Bruno. So we have the oldest white cube in the world, you could say, because in what was a picture gallery for the Savoia kings, Andrea Bruno, when restoring this in a white cube mode in the 1990s, turned us into, by chance, a combination of the concept of the neutral context of the white cube with the concept of the promenade to experience art, the window onto the world, which is the true window, and then the wall, which is the window onto the world, which is the artwork. So that's an interesting space used for the Franz Klein exhibition that I curated as a young person, I don't know when it was, in the 2000s. An internal view of William Kentridge's exhibition at the Castello di Rivoli, the first time he took the drawings and turned them into an installation that looks like the inside of one of his pieces, which is Felix in Exile, combining them on this blue paint. Pierre Huyghe working on his exhibition where he made a balloon in the shape of the exhibition space and worked with community, this was again the early 2000s, to create the space for the exhibition, and then it became a procession, and the gallery was taken up inside the space and softened the harshness of the white cube walls, softened the sunlight coming in, and showed his Bregenz piece, L'Expédition Scintillante. Another use of the same gallery that you saw the Fabbro in was Doris Salcedo Abyss in 2005, where she lowered the walls, the bricks from the ceiling, effectively almost closing in the visitors into the space, like into a prison room. Then I came here, and I thought that it would be a good idea to be very simple. And since we were in the opposite of Italy, and Piero Manzoni was from Italy, and he had made his fantastic Socle du Monde in Herning Park in Denmark, I thought I would just consider that as the socle of the world, and so we were on the other side, which is the top of the world, and we could just do this exhibition about the politics of reversal, revolution, inversion. And one of the most immediate thoughts was to ask Giuseppe Pennone to do a new piece, and he thought of a tree that the branches of the tree holding the stone could look and be as well the roots of the tree in the earth, but upside down, had it been installed in Italy. And that then was taken by me later. You'll see it in a later thing. Michael Snow with his De La, of course, circular filming, Rodchenko. No need to read you the concept. Gordon, the late Gordon, whom I am aware is no longer with us, made a beautiful proposal for an inversion of the ground floor and downstairs floor, upstairs floor here at the art gallery that was not realized, where the works from the floor below would have been upstairs and the ones from floor one would be downstairs, turned upside down, so readable for people who were standing in Italy, basically. Unfortunately, the museum, probably for the particular politics that could have upset a number of people, did not realize the project, but it became a model of a possible potential reinstallation of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Sometimes, because I've just cobbled together 5 PowerPoints last night, I didn't do it right. Like, I should take out the names of the artists. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. Just look at it like a draft, you know, half-done architecture. Dora Garcia printed her Fahrenheit 451 backwards, and by chance we stumbled upon this place. It was not a venue available. It was simply a place that nobody went to and were allowed to go to because the police wouldn't let you on it. Had been occupied by Aboriginal communities at some point, but it was full of asbestos and you couldn't go there. And we ended up doing this because the Harbour Trust entered, this is what it looked like. Harbour Trust entered into an alliance. That's actually Dora. It's very weird because this place was used by Nalini Malani, and that's the Tables Have Turned, a new work that Nalini Malani made for the exhibition, which will be shown soon in Castello di Rivoli, and we acquired it for our collections. In the Sydney Opera House, Dora enacted what would have been Lenny Bruce's performance had Lenny Bruce not been thrown out of Australia in the 60s for being offensive. So she created the performance that he would have done. And in the Opera House was also the magnificent reversal of inside and outside with the forest, a forest of lines, which he created inside the Opera House, a world inside out. Then I went over to dOCUMENTA, and probably thanks to the Sydney Biennial, I mean, these things are all connected. They don't just happen by choice. And I was suddenly confronted with another history and another catastrophe in the heart of Europe, because catastrophes and trauma happen everywhere. The Nazi-fascist period in Europe and the camps were certainly not a passeggiata. So I find history much more complex than the way that it's often told in simple narratives of the good and the bad, and Europe being only the colonial torturer of the rest of the world. I mean, it also is a place that internally has its own south, its own north, and its own traumas. And one of them was that due to the Nazis being in power and Kassel being a military factory production place, it was heavily bombed by the British, actually, who destroyed also the cultural spaces. They did not bomb the factories that were building bombs, and 6 months after the war, the factories were working again. So choices were made, and certainly the destruction of the Fridericianum, to me, will be a constant mystery. The way that art and culture they are so powerful that they are very important to destroy, as we know from the Bamyan Buddhas and so forth. They are the most powerful force that we have because they are our legacy through the centuries. The first dOCUMENTA, so the building was rebuilt, 1955. My dOCUMENTA, 2012. I was inspired by this photograph, anonymous photographer. I was inspired by the triangulation and the performativity of the art objects, which are small sculptures by Julio Gonzalez, and the triangulation that is created between the man, perhaps dressed almost in winter clothes, looking at the woman who deflects her gaze onto the sculpture in order to avoid a relation, maybe. But why are her feet bare? She's been walking, she's been looking at art. It's a very summary attire. So this photograph inspired the entire dOCUMENTA, basically, to make a long story short. And that's the concept, and I could do a whole lecture, tell you about this, but I think I won't. But everything that's in the dOCUMENTA is in here. And it talks, the red is speaking about spatial structuring of the exhibition. The green is thematic issues. Fundamentally, there were two core aspects to it. One is the exploration of the question of the destruction of art and civilizations and war and trauma. And the other was the flourishing of life on the planet and the question of what stories we can tell each other in a new alliance, a multi-species, an alliance of multi-species co-evolution. At the time, I was spending time with Donna Haraway, and of course, Annie Besant, whom I talked to you before, was one of the earliest so-called ecological thinkers at the time, which was a big question in the late 1800s as it became in our times, because of the rapidity of industrial change and innovation in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and again it is at the late 1900s and early 2000s as today. So those two aspects. I took a friend with me. This is actually the original object that was in front of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. It was the first thing I did in Castle was plant the tree. And I do believe in entanglement, and I do believe that on a subatomic level, particles are eternally connected, and so it is not just, you can't just take a copy of it and put it there. It changes what's going on a subatomic level. So I wanted the actual physical object to come, and it was planted there, and the sheep loved it as well. This is a piece that very few of the art world saw, because it's the counterpart in Kabul that in the Baghe Babur Gardens, Pennone made and gifted to the city of Kabul. Obviously, there's something's going on here that's not going on there. The tree will grow around the column, which is carved according to the lines of matter, the matter that's been compressed into the calcium-based column of marble. And it also is propping it up somehow. It's also a cannon which is not firing and so forth. Back in Castle, while I was spending much time with artists in Kabul without telling the press, which made that a meaningful and real experience as opposed to a symbolic experience on the level of communications, which we all must control and create in a very precise way if we want things to be activated in ways that at least our part of the intentionality of making exhibitions. Back in Castle, the Fridericianum was empty except for the wind of Ryan Gander, and there's something else in a vitrine down there, but we'll skip it. And in one of the rooms on the ground floor was the photograph with the original sculptures that had been in that photograph that I searched for months and months, and found them being bronze. There's more than one of each of them, but the one on the right was very difficult to find, and therefore repositioned the visitor in a folded time and space relationship with what was going on 50 years earlier. And in the research around that place in the Fridericianum, to find the place to position that shelf. So again, much of what I'm always thinking about is what's inside, what's outside the inside that then ends up being actually the inside of the outside. which is why at the core of the Fridericianum, I created this small exhibition in the exhibition, which is the brain. You could think of it as a kind of a Wunderkammer in the way that Wunderkammers were made, or cabinet, different kind of cabinets that juxtapose artifacts and artifacts made by nature that are not human determined. That was typical of long periods, 1500, 1600, 1700s. But actually, this is not what I did, because as you can see on the glass, there's a text. So instead of it being a centripetal, authoritative, patriarchal, paternalistic structure of the world coming in to the Wunderkammer, it's the world going out. Lines of flight went from the inside, outside, and Lawrence Wiener helped me by writing on the glass that you could only read it from the inside outward, so it indicates how your gaze is to be, the middle of the middle of the middle. So that was a kind of key to this reversal of the concept of the Wunderkammer. And things that were inside, like Morandi, well, this is about the paradox of art and life. On the back of the Morandi was the Lee Miller photographs in the apartment building of Hitler in Munich, where she entered with the American troops as a journalist, photojournalist. And I believe that this photograph she staged in the bathroom that her friend, David something or other, was taking. I had this all written somewhere, but it was lost in Singapore. It's an allusion to the large glass of Duchamp, in my view, for a certain number of reasons, but we're not telling you all that now, but just what the conclusion was. Opposite the photographs were original objects that Lee Miller stole from the apartment and that stayed in London until this exhibition. And we had to get a letter from the German government stating that the German government would never claim restitution, even if they were in Germany, because according to law, objects that belong to a governmental leader of the country can't be just stolen. But the German government wrote to the Lee Miller estate that they had no intention of claiming restitution of Hitler's towel or thermometer or Eva Braun's powder case, and therefore they needed not worry. They didn't want them back, and so we could bring them back for a temporary restitution. This is another case inside the case where you have the original bottles that Morandi painted before painting the paintings of the bottles, and one of the puppets that was used representing the representing the crusader Tancred in his cabaret crusades, so an inert puppet, and then also the book Son Chardin that Morandi loved. So it's somehow the whole brain was about the relations between the artist and the world, and the ethics and the responsibilities in those relations. This cabinet was about the same thing, but it had melted sculptures, ancient sculptures due to bombing, because the Beirut Museum is on the line where the civil war, the two sides of the Lebanese civil war were dislocated. And next to the melted figurines from Byblos, basically, is the palette knife that Etel Adnan had painted with for many years. This is a Bactrian princess, but I think that this is the first, beginning of a computer. It's Konrad Zuse, the switcher. Konrad Zuse did the Zuse 1, Zuse 2, Zuse 3, Zuse 4. Most of them were destroyed. The first computer in terms of hardware was built in Germany, and then there's the whole, who's doing what in Manchester and so forth, but that's software issues. We have to be careful in the history. And Judith did the little catalog guidebook for the brain, and her physical creation of it as a kind of folded paper was a visualization of what she saw was the structure in the creation of the brain. I don't know why I slipped this in. It's Anna Bogigian's room, that was overlooked by many, but today Anna Bogigyan is being widely looked at. And houses in the park, the house for Donna Haraway, the Songdong Do Nothing Garden, artworks and architecture by non-humans, beautiful things, civilizations around the world. Pierre Huyghe and I would talk a lot about that, and his space, this is Pierre's drawing for the dOCUMENTA piece. His space was, in fact, a collaboration between different agencies, different aesthetics, human and non-human, art and its withdrawal from the gaze in alliance with bees, a painted dog, leftovers from Dominique Gonzalez Forster. Clear Pentecost, she was composting, literally making ingots of earth. I was planting trees with Jimmy Durham in the park, and black Cherokee apple trees. So Lea Porsager, a little house, the reason it's in this PowerPoint is because this is in Kassel in dOCUMENTA, and this is actually in Monte Verita in Switzerland, in Ascona, because the model for me of the little houses in the park was the Monte Verita community of revolutionaries, anarchists, theosophists, vegetarians, and so forth, that my predecessor at dOCUMENTA, Harold Zeman, had dedicated a whole exhibition to after dOCUMENTA. Bamyan Buddha, destruction in Kassel of the bombing, destruction of the parliament in Kabul. One hotel, I searched for the one hotel with with Mario Garcia Torres. We found the one hotel, and we did seminars and workshops in Boetti's one hotel in Kabul. That's Alighiero Boetti, so back to Torino in Kabul in the 70s. Lynn mentioned something showing some works that he had done in collaboration with women embroiderers and in Kabul yesterday, but this is like the back office of all that. It's how it was done. Adrian in Kassel, Villa Rojas, and Adrian in Kabul. So most of the art world has a semi-vision of dOCUMENTA 13, because there was seriously a whole part of it that was not visible, also because you could not get a visa unless you were actually working for an NGO or for the Biennale itself. There were no tourist visas at the time, and therefore it was an exhibition where I willfully and intentionally did not want the art world there, but I wanted it to be for the community of people that were there. And effectively, aside from a few small things, it was the first exhibition of contemporary art in Afghanistan in the post-war period. That's Adrian working with people. It was basically a table to draw on. Adrian working on his table with a huge base. In Bamyan Valley, Michael Rakovitz organized a workshop on sculpture making because there was a whole debate at the time between the UNESCO and the European archaeologists who don't want the reconstruction of the Buddhas. They find that a kitsch idea, and the local communities that all want it to them to be rebuilt because they were a big attraction in the 1960s. And also the philosophy of conservation is not the same in Europe and non-Europe. So this concept of conserving the original materials and so forth is not necessarily one shared by the local communities there. So to get out of that complicated battle between UNESCO and local communities, he said, listen, it's not us to decide. I'm just going to teach everybody to sculpt, and then they can do whatever the fuck they want after that. And 5 miles down the road, they make another Buddha or something, or sculpt an iPod or something. So the fruits of this workshop were then shown in Kassel and also in Kabul. And this is Mariam Ghani. She's one of the Afghan artists who was in Kassel, somehow connecting the destructions of Kassel with the destruction of Kabul many years later. The half of the work of Goshka Machuga shown in Kabul, and half of the work of Goshka Machuga shown in Kassel. So again, the partiality and the impossibility of holding something as a autonomous object, whether mental or not. Then came Istanbul. Well, actually, then came nothing for a year or two. I was just teaching and thinking I'd never do an exhibition. But then came along the proposition of Istanbul Biennial, and we were 100 years from the Armenian genocide. So if you ever want to do the Istanbul Biennale in my lifetime, it probably would have been at that time. I thought that's a challenge, you know, with Erdogan being president and it being 100 years from the genocide. It's not an easy task, given also the history of eradication of Greek culture and Greek people that had continued up till the 60s and 70s of the 20th century. So I thought I would speak with through a hidden language, as I always do. I don't really say things directly too much, because I think everything we say is false in the minute which it's stated, as Adorno also thought. So I thought I would speak through the salt crystal. Salt is a way of speaking about something that is in the world of embodied matter, that is the most dangerous armament against the technological society. Because if you drop your cell phone into a salt water, that's it. Because the ions will act in the electrical attractions will be such that it's finished. If you drop it in sweet water or in a lot of other things, you can repair it. But basically, it gets corroded immediately. And yet, salt in our bodies, with no salt, we die within 5 days, because we lose the ability for our neuronic cells to do the electrical exchange from positive, negative, which is necessary. So, and I also love the colors of salt. This was when I got the idea, when I saw this person in a plane with her little plant and her cell phone, and I thought, So continuing in my interest in alliance between the so-called natural world and the so-called technological, which is a false opposition, I decided that it would not be an exhibition about East-West relations, you know, Europe and the Orient and Turkey as on the border between the two, but I would create this more north-south or northeast-southwest line, which focused on the connection of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean and the salt water, and those exchanges as opposed to the other exchanges, and went back to Annie Besant and her thought forms, which reminded me of the earliest drawings in the 19th century of neurons and how those passages I just described occur, which reminded me of a bunch of things which I can't describe, including the knot theory of Lacan, and including knotting water in physics now with William Irvine's lab, and so, which included also psychoanalysis in Bracha Ettinger, and included again Anna Bogigian. This is the Salt Traders, which now belongs to the collection of Rivoli. We're going to skip that. Works that were not seen by anybody because they were installed in buildings that we had no access to, but cheat sheets, Genio Pecunio in the former bank, again, Michael. This was a homage to Tahrir, not Tahrir Square, of course, to the square in Istanbul. Taksim, thanks so much. So we brought in the whole question of Pilica da Volpedo and the Fourth Estate, and connected with Michelangelo Pistoletto's rags and documentary works around the uprisings. And I didn't have Annie Besant's original drawings and paintings that she had published in her book, The Thought Forms. So I asked Lea Porsager if she wanted to copy them, and she made a perfect copy of the book, basically. This is the book without the text. And the images of the thought forms in gouache are in the exact positions they were in her original book. The bark petition came, and the saltwater paintings. So again, resistance through salt and water, and the first sea rights in Australia. That was a wonderful collaboration with the whole incident of Palm Island with the Australian Arts Council, which was greatly supportive of the Istanbul Biennale project. And can't talk about everything, from Armenian red to Turkish red. Adrian in the Trotsky House. I have so many stories to tell you, and this is the submerged ongoing project of Pierre underwater near this island. And then I made my smallest exhibition. My smallest exhibition in my life was a homage to Annie Besant, the same Annie Besant I keep talking about, and I did it in Theaster Gates a cultural institution called Bank in Chicago. He bought a bank during the financial crisis and saved the bank, basically from being demolished, and turned it into this south side of Chicago cultural center for exhibitions. And he said, why don't you do an exhibition here? And so I was honored after the largest exhibition of my life, which was dOCUMENTA, to curate the smallest exhibition, which is a little bit like Zeman's grandfather show, in my view, because I know what it feels like when you want to do something like that. She's a bit like my grandmother in my mind. And it was called Intention to Know. And that's the bank in Chicago. And that's inside the bank, where many, many books are. It all emerges from Theastergate's Dorchester project, where he also saved all the slides from that were being thrown out after digitalization of the art history department at University of Chicago. As we know the narrative of the story of Dorchester and of his project. So that's the inside of the exhibition, where I showed the Lea Porsager from Istanbul. They went there. And they were also the core of the exhibition Colori in Torino last year. So they've been traveling around for years, these Lea Porsager copies. But in the vitrine here, you also find the story of the finding of the original watercolors, because I was searching for them for years, and they ended up being found in a box of things in Varanasi Library in India. So they are effectively, in my view, the earliest abstract works of Western culture, art history. Colleen Smith made this. She's an artist from Chicago. That's the pen of Annie Besant, and documents and photographs lent by the Theosophical Society. That's the book in its first edition. It was co-authored with Charles Ledbetter, who was at the time the president of the Theosophical Society, but I don't think he wrote a line in that book. I think she was just not able to publish it as a woman without Ledbetter's dominating presence. But that doesn't happen that much nowadays, which is nice. And anyway, again, the pieces that they were extremely influential on the emergence of Western abstraction in the early 20th century. The book was published in 1905. Kandinsky had it, of course, through his dealings through Gabriele Munter, his wife, in his summer visits to Murnau. But that's another long story that we could tell. So then what happened is I went home to the museum that opened in 1984, and that happens to be the only museum in the world that has been run by two dOCUMENTA directors, because the first one, director of the museum, was Rudi Fuchs, who had invited the Italian Arte Povera artists to the 1982 dOCUMENTA after Zeman had invited them already in 72. And I believe it was an initiative of the artists themselves. Why don't you come to Italy and start a museum? We don't have one. In fact, it's the first museum of contemporary art in Italy. So we're back to the beginning, as in a Klein bottle. And we just keep going. This is the model, the wooden model for it. And this is what it should have been, as I've already told you. And this is another view with a calzolari work in the courtyard. And we're back to that, but Anna's there just before she left with all her studio to come to Rivoli. We basically reconstructed her studio in the Castello di Rivoli just some months ago. That's in the same room that had the Pierre Huyghe. And she created her first retrospective exhibition, which now is a wonderful collaboration with the Sharjah Art Foundation, and it's currently being exhibited. It just opened with the March openings at the Sharjah Art Foundation. The theory behind the retrospective is that all her work emerges from the book. Of course, she's Armenian, culture of the book. And the book, the leaves of the book, the pages of the book become the pages on the walls. And this is a new work that she did around Nietzsche's time in Torino. As we know, Torino was Friedrich Nietzsche's favorite city. It's also where he saw the horse being beaten in Piazza Carignano, and he said, "Stop, stop, don't hurt the horse." And he threw his body on the horse to protect the horse and got arrested and then sent to an insane asylum, although he thought that the emperor, Austro-Hungarian emperor, would better be put in a cage and sent away. And the Christ figure, as you see, has to do with potency and impotency, and Nietzsche's figure behind. So we reinstalled the dOCUMENTA piece that you saw earlier in the Manica Lunga, which is the unfinished symphony about the tragedy of the repetition of history, the unfinished business of the First World War causing the Second World War, the unfinished business of colonialism causing the First World War, the unfinished business before that, in this cyclical, eternal return in a, let's say, Nietzschean view of history. This is the salt traders again, so you see it installed in the Manica Lunga, and ending up with the Battle of Actium and the Nîmes piece. So what am I working on today? I'm working on the incorporation into the Castello di Rivoli of the most magnificent collection of art in Europe, private collection of art. Mr. Cerruti died in 2015, leaving all his collection of works from the Middle Ages to Arte Povera in a foundation in the villa that he built 3 minutes walking distance from the Castello di Rivoli, a museum he loved and saw all exhibitions at. And we just did a little quick flip on our logo and created the logo of the Collezione Cerruti, C as Cerruti, C as collection. And in the era of the private collections all becoming museums, which started actually in Torino with Patrizia Sandretto Rerebaudengo 20 years ago, but now has become the dominant model, emerging model for museums, private museums around the world. We decided that we'd collect the collector, and therefore focus on not just taking in the works, but focusing on how it is, the associations and the house. So we're actually opening, soon to open in the next spring, the house which hosted his collection, which is going to become our new building, the third building. So the history of Castello di Rivoli is 1984, the main Juvara building, 1999, the Manica Lunga, the long sleeve, 2019, the Cerruti collection. That's what it looks like now on the bottom left. That's what it's going to look like in a few months, because we've been working on, we took all the works, of course, out, and they're in storage, and this is him, and we're securing and climatizing the villa. There's him as a little boy. He was coming from a rather humble bookbinding factory. In the 50s, he goes to America to see the Harris machines of perfect binding, which means binding with glue and not sewing. He brings them back, and he changes them and patents a way of perfect binding where the pages don't get unstuck. So fortunately, our books, the sheets don't go out like in the Anna Bugigians. And this is him shortly before his death. And this is the villa inside with the, you can see on the left, on the right, Paris Bordone, on the left, the only Pontormo portrait of a man in a private collection in the world. There are only about 20 altogether. The other existing one is in Tom Hill collection in California. And the associations between all the works this is the bedroom where he never slept. Up on the top left, the only Sassetta in a private collection. Our Modigliani is now on view, or may still be on view, in the great Modigliani show at the Tate. It's one of the most beautiful and exquisite, La Belle Espagnole, a Paolini work, Ebla. The dining room, where he did eat, because on Sundays he would eat there. He actually lived in a very humble apartment downtown on top of the factories, and he ended up binding 50 million phone books for 50 years, plus every other book ever bound in Italy, plus having revenues from these patents. And in his mirror-clad Baroque dining room, he chose to hang all of his Dequiricos. He had the largest collection of metaphysical Dequiricos in the world. And you can see also on the left the departure of the Argonauts, which has been, he used to lend works, but anonymously to exhibitions. You can see on the right the self-portrait with shadow, which is there. And these are just some of the paintings that we now have on view inside the Castello di Rivoli main building while we're waiting to show the whole villa in the spring. By the way, De Chirico loved Torino, spent some time in Torino after Milan and before Florence in 1910, and he said that the city was a metaphysical city, and may have inspired many of his paintings. That brings us back to the Klein bottle and to the lecture on love. This is a drawing by our friend Julio Gonzalez, the author of those sculptures. And so, there she is again. So I was wondering how many minutes I have left, because I may need to not deliver that lecture, or not deliver even the end of that lecture, or if I have 5-10 minutes, I could deliver at least the beginning and the end. Okay, good. So we're looking at thought forms. Okay, now we want to know something about love. Okay, I have it here. So when I wrote this lecture, it was 2015, and I wrote the day before yesterday with my students at Northwestern. We created a new website, Annie Besant-Gertrude Stein. In the About section, which indicates its purpose, we wrote, Annie Besant was born in 1847. Gertrude Stein was born in 1874. That is interesting, and it is interesting us. Gertrude Stein studied under William James and invented modernism. She saw how objects were experienced, and she liked looking at oil paintings. Annie Besant studied under Madame Blavatsky and saw thought forms as embodied and usually invisible objects, and she invented modernism. This is a reasonable reason to open this website. Today, October 28th, 2015, a group of Northwestern University students from the Art Theory and Practice Department, whose names are, together with Professor Christov-Bakargiev, create this website for the purpose of furthering the study of the relations between Annie Besant and Gertrude Stein. This is done for the purpose of establishing relations between their times and ours, and understanding modernisms differently. This is done for the purpose of clearly finding a purpose for us in the cosmos, and as earthbound creatures and as social beings who try to answer the question of how to live. There are many problems we think about, and we think about them through Gertrude Stein and Annie Besant. One of those problems we think about is love. I would like to be Annie Besant for today and act as her medium for you. What would she say today about love, she who so much loved? Just the other day, one of those students showed me a video lecture by Slavoj Žižek, where he argued that in the internet age there is a fear and an avoidance, not of love, but of the shattering and revolutionary experience of falling in love, an avoidance of the falling in part, through, for instance, online dating websites providing good matches for us, thus avoiding the risks of falling. Falling can hurt. Because our times are characterized by expulsion, as Saskia Sassen writes in her new book at the time, Expulsions, expulsion from citizenship, expelled from a country like a refugee, expelled from one's own social contract in jail, but also water and plants, expelled from the biosphere in the Anthropocene and environmental crises. This fear of falling is all the more strong and has turned into a fear of falling out rather than of falling in. So all falling is carefully avoided. In the same video, Žižek also sees the violence in Christian love and of all religious definitions of love. Philosopher Alain Badiou 10 years ago defined the 20th century as a century during which humans loved humans so much that they wanted to transform them into perfect humans, and thus they destroyed so many of them along the way through fascist regimes or so-called communist ones that were not communist at all close to forms of modern, intransigent religious love. Love is still a mystery, even though neuroscience has attempted in recent years to decode it through fMRI scans of people's brains while they look at images of people. For example, when they try to study love at first sight. Generally, these perspectives are utilitarian and see love as fundamentally no more or no less than an ability of the brain to quickly identify people who may be good matches for us, good meaning compatible, and thus useful for the survival of our genes. Theosophy, a 19th century spiritualist movement, would not suggest such an approach. Neither would physics, especially quantum, and I believe quantum is indeed rather theosophical. So now I'm going to skip all the part about theosophy and love, and I'm going to go towards the end. Excuse me, bear with me. Basically, or in other words, we either accept that the physical world runs fundamentally on love, if we call entanglement another name for love, or we must believe in a predetermined universe that unfolds inevitably. In other words, an authoritarian God. I prefer to engage in the first hypothesis, as would have Annie Besant. Now, we use this word love to describe both romantic love, which is connected but not equated with desire, and agape, or selfless love, the great Buddhist compassion, which requires no exchange of gifts, only a boundless giving to the world. The love of siblings for their parents or of a mother for her child sits somewhere in between. Neuroscience calls this kind of love, the impulse to care for others, empathy, and it explains it thanks to mirror neurons that are fired more or less in different people's brains when they feel in themselves the same effect that a stimulus provokes in another person when they see that other person subjected to a stimulus, whether painful or pleasurable. There may be a dark side to empathy too. When we feel empathy, indeed, we have also trigger problem-solving thoughts and often attempt to share those with others so that they may benefit from what our solutions would be for ourselves. This is where love, whether from a lover, a parent, or from a political leader, can become abusive and violent. While love can be violent and masqueraded as peaceful, the falling in part cannot. It opens our core to the possibility of being shattered, welcomes fragility and vulnerability, and thus is close to courage, cœur, coming from the French, cor, heart in Latin, the laying bare of our hearts, open to being destroyed. All the power Annie Besant exerted was only an expression of this fragility and willingness to fail and to fall. Because we cannot access the real except via the imaginary and through the symbolic order of language, Lacan would say, to attempt to truly access the real through the organic, the body, or through the technological, the imaginary, without failing, without falling, leads only to collective and personal psychosis. I just get to the end of this. Okay, then I start to say that Judith Butler talks about commitment and love, and I discuss her theory of commitment, and now I get to the end. Differently from Butler, my question is how to maintain a position of fragility of the performative speech act without commitment. And I see no reason why Butler needs to address commitment in relation to love. Let us for a moment integrate another concept, that of trust. Levinas's question in his book Totalité et Infini concerns how subjectivity is constituted. When we encounter the face, the visage of the other, we both connect ourselves outside of ourselves and also mark the limit of our solitude. our impossibility of breaking into and becoming with the self of another. We ask, please do not kill me, and in the act of grace, when the other's potential shattering violence or rejection does not occur, here the personal is constituted. When a subject is not subjected to the other, subjectus, thrown under, humiliated, there is an act of grace, gratia, to be thankful, where an instance of trust is gained. We encounter the visage of the other and trust that he or she will not kill us. Butler argues for a process of continual commitment. I love you and I choose you again and again. I did not choose you once, but I continued to choose you. And what there is in me, of me, in my speech is given to you again and again through this speech act, declaration, vow, and promise, one that binds me to you in the present, whatever that present happens to be. That means as well that one binds oneself to the process of becoming different as circumstances demand, which means that in all repetition there is unknowing. But what is this choosing dependent on? Last paragraph. On what basis do we choose again and again, to return to Besant's concept of the need of choosing, if every instant and every encounter is a new one with an unknown factor? If we do not know the other because we live a continuous renewal of the present, then we cannot choose what we do not know. We can only fall into it. And to allow ourselves to fall, to leap, to fail, we need to trust that there are no rocks below the cliff and that someone's body will catch us and carry us momentarily. Perhaps what we do is engage not in a continuous commitment, but in a journey of trust, like entangled subatomic particles knotted together, not in a deathly arrested state, but dancing across the universe, spooky action at a distance. And it is perhaps precisely in the sphere of trust that love for persons, romantic love, and love for people in the social can be connected. The love in the polis, in the street, in the demonstration, and the love in the private interpersonal sphere. Trust is the opposite of commitment, and yet it lies at the heart of committed speech and committed acts, when we trust that the words, I love you, will indeed reach the other, after hovering as a thought form in the ether, neither you nor me removing the self from the self, falling and floating outside of a spatially bound location in an expanded field and time, like a Klein bottle. It is a field where expulsion can miraculously transform into inclusion. That's all, folks.